Good morning, all of you. Today we have another brainstorming session by the NIAS Consciousness Studies program. And today's discussion is on phenomenological approach to qualitative research. This discussion is being chaired this morning by Dr. Saurabh Todaria. And he would be introducing the speakers for the morning and also chairing the discussion. The topic is phenomenological approach to qualitative research. And we have two distinguished philosophers, and their work has always emphasized perhaps the importance of methodology and also perhaps the special interest in phenomenology as an approach as well as a method. So I request Dr. Saurabh to initiate the program this morning.
So good morning to all of you. So on behalf of our NIAS CSP team and chairperson, we welcome both these distinguished philosophers. So it is both honor and privilege to introduce two leading philosophers and the phenomenologists of our country. So Professor Koshy Tharakan is professor in the Department of Philosophy, University of Goa. He did his PhD from University of Hyderabad, and his specialization in phenomenology, particularly in the philosophy of social sciences. And he published widely in area of social sciences, phenomenology, methodology, environmental ethics, and hermeneutics. And he is well-known scholar in the philosophy community in abroad as well. So we welcome you, Professor Koshy. And we also welcome Professor Prasenjit Biswas. He is currently associate professor in Department of Philosophy, Northeastern Hill University, Shillong. And he, just to mention that Professor Koshy Tharakan has also taught in IIT Gandhinagar also, and then he again moved to University of Goa. So Professor Prasenjit Biswas had taught in the various university, IIT Guwahati, IIT Bombay, and IMS Dhanbad. And his PhD is from the NEHU, and his PhD was on Rorty, Habermas, and Derrida. And he is the leading phenomenologist of the country and also one of the pioneers in India in post-structuralists, especially in Derrida. And he published widely in the field of interdisciplinary, especially ethnophilosophy, ethnicity, and the identity politic. And he's also a noted human rights activist in India. So we welcome you. And now, so as the structure of our program, our brainstorming session is that we will start with the brief introduction of ourselves and the work area and the work, so that the speakers can get idea about the people. Yeah.
So I'm in the 5th year of my doctoral work here in NIAS under Dr. Sangeeta Menon. My broad area of interest is in philosophy of mind. In that I am interested in the metaphysical question of consciousness. My dissertation work itself deals with contemporary resilient panpsychism. My other interests are in metaphysics and in philosophy of science as well. Before my PhD here, I have done my Masters of Arts in Education from Azim Premji University. Thank you.
Good morning, sir. Myself, Amrita. So my research, I am working here as a research associate and doing my PhD under Sangeeta Menon. And my research interests are in Indian aesthetics, particularly on Dhwani theory. And I'm working on the ritual performance arts from Kerala and to understand why do we enjoy a performance. So I did my graduation from Delhi University and post-graduation from Miranda House in English literature. Welcome you, sir.
Hello sir, good morning. Myself Priyanka. I have a background in psychology. I am working under Sangeeta ma'am as well as Nitin sir, looking into qualitative and quantitative aspects of yoga.
So, my name is Ashwini. I'm working as project assistant.
Good morning, sir. Myself Shweta. I'm working as a JRF here. My background is in engineering. So currently I'm working with Dr. Nitin in a project on Satyam. Thank you.
Hello sir, I'm Meera. I'm a second year PhD scholar here. I'm working under Sangeeta Menon. I'm working on language and consciousness, particularly literature in Kerala, in the Mantravada traditions of Kerala. And my background is in literature from the University of Hyderabad, and then my UG was from Christ University.
Hello, sir. I'm Niharika. I have a background in philosophy from Delhi University, then my master's in Indian philosophy and religion from Banaras Hindu University. I'm currently working as a PhD scholar under Professor Sangeeta Menon. I'm doing a textual-based research on Kashmir Saivism, one of the schools in Indian philosophy. So I'm trying to figure out the philosophical background of the school with consciousness. So, and I'm also doing my research with the help of Shankar sir here.
Good morning, sir. Welcome to NIAS. I am Hari Krishnan. I have a background in engineering, and here I am working in machine learning. I am currently working as a research associate and also doing my PhD with the guidance of Dr. Nitin Nagaraj. Basically, my area of interest is chaos theory inspired learning algorithms.
Hi, welcome to NIAS, to both of you. I'm Dr. Nitin. I'm a faculty here at NIAS. My background is in electrical engineering. Done my PhD in chaos theory. But I've got interested in scientific theories of consciousness, especially the integrated information theory of consciousness. And the other thing I'm also interested in is looking at causality, especially causality testing in neuroscience and mathematical aspects of causality. Thank you.
My name is Sangeeta, and I think one of the fascinating questions to me these days is what is the purpose of philosophy? So that's why it's very important, I think, to listen to Professor Prasenjit and Professor Koshy and Dr. Saurabh as well, why we do philosophy, particularly in the context of phenomenological method, which is an inquiry into the purpose of direct experiences itself. And it's also important, I think, to mention that perhaps many of us who have introduced this morning and the work we do, being supported by the TATA Trust, it is because of the two projects which TATA Trust have kindly granted to us that we are able to be here together and discuss some of these ideas. I think Dr. Shankar has not introduced, so he has to introduce.
Good morning, sirs. I am Shankar Rajaraman. I have a background in medicine. I did my MBBS from Ramaya Medical College and then did my post-graduation in psychiatry. I did my PhD from NIAS. PhD in psychology on the topic titled A Qualitative Approach to the Psychology of Three Self-Conscious Emotions from Sanskrit Poetics. I am now working as a postdoc fellow here on Kashmir Shaivism.
So myself Saurabh Tureria, and I'm working as a research associate with Professor Sangeeta Menon here. And I did my MPhil and PhD in philosophy from JNU. My MPhil was on comparative study of Hegel and Derrida, and PhD was on the problem of on Heidegger, especially the problem of relation between the time and consciousness in phenomenology, especially with Heidegger. And right now I'm pursuing, I'm looking at the problem of the notion of the transcendence in the Kashmiri Shaivism from the phenomenological point of view, especially from the especially from taking the body as the departure point and how through the transcendence can be thought of through body. So just to tell about the structure of our brainstorming session is that it will be that both of our speakers, they will speak on the theme on phenomenological approach to qualitative research from 10 to 15 minutes, and that then the floor will be open to discussion so that we all can interact with you on the various research problems we are having in our particular field. So just to tell a few words about this, why we have chosen this research this title. So Dr. Shankar, when we are discussing with Dr. Shankar and we are discussing this, so he suggested this phenomenological approach to qualitative research. Particularly, he made a very remarkable point that most of us are doing here the qualitative research, and we might be using the phenomenological approach, but we might not be very clear or very theoretically clear about it. In this brainstorming session, a lot of things will get clear about the phenomenological approach. So what we had in the mind is particularly because there is a problem of objectivity always in methodology, and But when we engage with the qualitative research, so there is the first person experience, lived experiences, and there is the problem of interpretation. So how to think of the interpretation, which on the one hand does not become totally subjective, but also can be captured methodologically and can qualify to become theory, so that it can be applied to the various research problems. So with this words, I invite Professor Koshy to share his wisdom with us.
Thank you for this opportunity, for being here at NIAS and to interact with many of these scholars and all. I mean, I've been, Professor Sangeeta Menon, myself, we know for quite long, decades. So also Professor Prasenjit and of course, Shaurabh also. But many of you have interacting perhaps for the first time. So I thought why I agreed for this session, that's what I am just trying to tell. I thought I would benefit from listening to you how you are going about with your research. So rather than me speaking at length, I would be keenly listening to your research, problems and the kind of approach that you were following. But let me briefly tell what I have been doing, because I have to say something about phenomenological approach. Well, when I started using phenomenology, it was to understand social reality. How to understand social reality. So phenomenology I used as a methodology to understand social reality. And that actually I've started not from Husserlian phenomenology, to be frank. I started from a Weberian, Max Weber's kind of approach to social sciences, where Weber talks about Verstehen as the method of studying the social world, in contrast to positivist method, which is even now the dominant paradigm in social science research. So I'm sure all of you are aware about the positivist approach, which is not a very qualitative kind of a research. It's more, it's a basis for what we call the quantitative kind of an approach, where you collect the data, then you may have a hypothesis on the basis of which you collect data, and then you generalize, arrive at some sort of a theory, then try to verify all those kinds of approach, which we usually do the empirical kind of studies. But then why Weberian kind of an approach to the social world? It's partly because of the belief of the phenomenologist as well as interpretivist at large, hermeneutists and all, that the social world is not just something which is out there. It is not a finished reality, a fact which is out there which we need to capture. Rather, we as agents, as human beings, do construct the social world. So there is a view about social construction of reality. Again, in philosophy, it's nothing new, because even going back to Kant, there is this notion, reality is something which the human involvement, the subject role of the subject, through categories of understanding, which do make. So that's one of the reasons why Weber's response to the positivism, that unless you capture the agents, the subject's meanings, you won't understand what is the action the agent performs. So the whole idea of the phenomenological approach of the first phase, the Weberian phase, is to capture the agent's perspective, so that what the agent understands or defines as the reality, we need to understand. So Weber's prescription was that you need to understand the motive of the agent behind an action, to understand what that action is. Of course, then we have problems about, is it possible to capture the agent's intentions, authorial intentions? Comes the next phase of hermeneutics, phenomenology, the Gadamerian philosophical hermeneutics, which spells out that there is no such privileged perspective where you can capture the authorial motives. Rather, our understanding is prejudiced. It already comes with certain kinds of presuppositions. So, and again, Professor Prasenjit is more qualified to talk about all those Derridian deconstructions and the death of the author concept, etc. in literature. So this concept of understanding the agent's motive becomes problematic. So how does a Husserlian phenomenology negotiate these kinds of a dilemma? There are two things. As a quick take, I will say. One, Husserlian phenomenology, while appreciating all these Weberian kind of interventions, nonetheless also sees the possibility that a phenomenological approach from the first person doesn't mean that it's totally subjective, nor when Weber actually intended capturing the motives, I mean, as Schutz, one of the exponents of phenomenological research method in social sciences, Alfred Schutz, has clarified as a response to positivists like Ernst Nagel, Karl Hempel, that Weber doesn't mean that motives are something private, something inaccessible to the other. Rather, we understand the motives in terms of the life world, the lived world, which is shared by all. The German word Lebenswelt, as Husserl's writings talks about, the Lebenswelt is what is given to us. So coming back to the Husserlian concept of Lebenswelt or life world, Husserl, one of his last writings published posthumously, European Crisis, the crisis of European sciences and transcendental phenomenology, that's the title of the text, talks about the kind of crisis that science faces. If we understand science as a process of abstracting from the world in which we live by theoretical idealizations, logical substructions of thought, you create a reality which displaces the everyday reality we understand. For example, in the everyday world, we encounter colors, the rainbow, the spectrum, which we see. But if you ask a physicist, he will translate all this into the language of physics, where he employs the notion of wavelength and the theory of refraction, all those things, which displaces in a way what we have seen as the reality. The phenomenon of a rainbow is now translated as something else. And this is what even philosophers of science like Mary Hesse pointed out, that if you follow the positivistic model of explanation, the standard format is DN model, as you all know, deductive phenomenological model of explanation. What finally we get is something, the fact to be explained is redescribed. There is a redescription of the phenomenon to be explained if you follow this model, which works pretty well for physics. That's perhaps how physics works. There may not be another way of doing physics, perhaps. I'm not quite into that. But when it comes to social world, this creates a problem, that you are now redescribing something, a phenomenon, social phenomenon, from certain theoretical, using certain theoretical lens, which was not what actually presented to us as a phenomenon. So what is the goal of the social research then? So certainly if the phenomenologist would say it's not the kind of explanation which positivists have advanced, it is not to deduce a phenomenon using certain laws as its premises and certain initial conditions from which you deduce a phenomenon, which is a standard model in physics. That won't work. So the emphasis shifts to something from explanation to what in phenomenology and qualitative research they call as understanding or first hand. And that's what Weber was talking about. In essence, you need to understand. But Weber doesn't stop there. That's one of the requirements, adequacy at the level of meaning, as Weber would call it. Then Weber also proposes, as part of his social science research, there is a requirement of adequacy at the level of causation, empirical causation, which pretty well goes along with what the positivist would be doing. And that's the reason why there are sometimes among Weber scholars differing interpretations, like is Weber a totally a kind of interpretivist as he was made to be, or was there some sort of a positivist understanding of explanation within, because Weber also uses the word erklärendes explanation, that kind of erklärendes understanding. So this kind of approach within sociology is what Schutz, as a phenomenologist, adopted in various studies. Of course, he introduces various nuances to the understanding of social reality by explaining about the various structures of the life world. It is not just one, as Husserl, of course, did not elaborate that, but Schutz goes further in showing the different structures of life world as the world of the contemporaries, the world of the predecessors, the world of successors, so the Umwelt, various kinds of levels where there may not be some sort of direct kind of interaction at some levels. If world of, the predecessors is no longer available to us, successors is yet to come. So, however, all these kinds of structures, there is a crucial element of understanding the intentional meanings, intentional structures from the perspective of the agent, the actors. And we being one among us as social science research, for Schutz, the problem would be then how to construct an objective. That's how even Schauder put it when phenomenology comes, the question of objectivity, how such an objective account can be generated from a subjective approach. Interestingly, some of the issues in philosophy of mind also captures with this dilemma, which one of the philosophers of mind, Thomas Nagel, in one of his articles precisely highlighted this problem of understanding bat from bat's point of view rather than from a zoologist or a what is it like to be a bat kind of a problem. That's essentially the phenomenological dilemma. So Schutz's proposal was to look at it at two levels. So at level one, try to understand the agent's perspective, meaning what is called Verstehen at the ontological level. Then move on to interpret these in terms of certain empirical facts where you can compare, like Weber has said, verify. So there is a second order construct. We need to have a second order construct on this first level construct which the agents bestow on reality. So that is the methodology which a phenomenologist like Schutz proposes to understand social reality. I think I will stop here, then let Professor Prasenjit also, and then we can proceed, because I'm sure he can introduce various other nuances from philosophy of mind too. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks to Professor Koshy, Professor Sangeeta, other colleagues, and Saurabh for bringing me here in this discussion. Some of it is very lucidly stated by Professor Koshy already. I won't repeat them, but one thing that needs to be talked about a little more is this agential perspective, the perspective of the agent. So what kind of perspective an agent can take on the social world? One option is a first-person perspective. So when we talk about first-person perspective of the agent in his or her own surroundings, the crucial concept in phenomenology is that of life world, which is partly developed by Husserl, partly developed by Alfred Schutz. Of course, beyond that, life world is also explained. Now, life world for Schutz is supposed to be an available structure of cognition. Available structure of cognition would mean the ideas, the customs, the norms, the values that are already available in a certain social surrounding in which the agent is living, of which agent is inseparably, inextricably a part of. That is, from where agent cannot extricate himself or herself, even if he or she wishes or desires to. Now, if such an agent tries to understand his or her own surroundings, the agent has to take note of the already available mental categories, the social categories, in terms of which that social world is structured or organized. Now, when agent brings back those social categories in his or her understanding of his or her own social reality, the agent produces a certain kind of a self-understanding, a certain interpretation of the social reality, a certain kind of involvement and participation in that very act of understanding through which the agent is trying to interpret or understand the social reality for himself or for herself. Now, this is a kind of first-person perspective. Now, the problem for a social scientist is to understand this first-person agent's perspective as a social scientist. The social scientist is not a first person in a particular social surrounding. Rather, the social scientist is coming from outside and trying to understand the insider's perspective or the first-person perspective. So how can a social scientist understand the insider's perspective is a major question for phenomenology. Now, in that, what is very important is that the social scientist should be able to transpose himself or herself in the place of the agent whom she is trying to understand. Easier said than done. How can I transpose myself in the shoe of the other person is an important question. And this question is an epistemological question, also an ethical question. because one must be ethically justified in transporting oneself to completely absorb one in the perspective of the other, the perspective that the other takes on herself. Now this will require a kind of overcoming of the prejudices, the pre-understanding, and the already obtained standpoint that the social scientist has in himself or in herself, in order to take it beyond and get into the agential perspective. And this is a point of a very, very difficult negotiation. How that negotiation will happen is entirely phenomenological. Phenomenological in the sense that it takes into account the subjective experience of the other person. Now, subjective experience of the other person cannot be understood objectively. Subjective experience of the other person can be understood in two ways. One of the ways is to understand where my subjective experience is same as the subjective experience of the other person, where my subjective experience is different from the subjective experience of the other person. So simultaneously, there will be these two registers of sameness and difference. Now, as far as sameness is concerned, it's very easy to say that, well, we are in agreement. We are not only in conceptual agreement, but we also agree about our particular understanding of the social reality. But where it is entirely different, let's say someone coming from an entirely different background and trying to understand a totally different society with which he or she has no initial contact. In such a case, how that contact will be created, how a certain kind of a match will be created, how a certain kind of translation of the language of the other will happen in my own language. These are the critical issues. And there is no direct answer to this. Phenomenologically, suffice it to say that the subjective experience of other is different from my own subjective experience. And this difference creates not a roadblock, but the difference creates a creative challenge for me in order to decode that difference, in order to interpret the difference in a certain way. It will depend on my own perspective, my own wisdom to interpret that difference. How am I going to interpret this difference? Now, one of the major issues there is to understand the wisdom of the other community. You can understand the knowledge that the other community has. You can understand the language the other community speaks. But how does one understand the wisdom, if there is any such thing? And wisdom is something which is inexpressible in everyday life, but it manifests in everyday life. Everyday life is not possible without the wisdom. So everyday life provides you certain cues to understand the wisdom of the other person belonging to another society. Now, this is where social science creates diverging kind of discourses, because no two social scientists will agree about the understanding of the wisdom that a particular social scientist has developed. So there will be divergent understanding of wisdom or wisdoms, let's say. Now the point of objectivity comes back here. Whether a certain understanding of wisdom is objectively available in a certain society or not. How would a social scientist verify that or validate that? That is an important question. Now, to this question, there are theoretical framing. You have heard about Frankfurt School, which deployed phenomenology, starting from Adorno, Horkheimer, to Walter Benjamin, down to Habermas. They all have critiqued positivism, in the sense that the wisdom that is available in another society cannot be positively interpreted, cannot be interpreted as it is, because by an act of interpretation, this has been already changed to something different. Now this needs to be communicated. How that communication will happen is another question. And that's a more difficult question at the, let's say, at the second order or the third order level. How the social scientist will transmit back the understanding of wisdom that he or she has gathered about a particular society back to that society in order to validate it. Now, most of the social scientists don't take the trouble to validate the kind of knowledge that they have gathered of the other society. They leave it confined to what they have gathered and what they have systematized. So that leaves open the possibility of a critique of what the social scientist has done. And that critique can come from that society which the social scientist has studied, or from the larger community of social scientists as well. So critique becomes, as Frankfurt School also says, becomes an essential ingredient of doing social science, an essential ingredient for understanding the wisdom of the other. Now, what is a critique all about? You can ask this question. What is phenomenological about the idea of critique? Now, this again brings us back the idea of transposition. In order to critique a certain rendering of knowledge, a certain rendering of wisdom, one has to take that wisdom or knowledge as an object of critique. And that's where a certain sense of objectivity would come. Unless something is available for a critique, the critique cannot progress. But the critique is meant for disagreement. Critique is meant for a certain kind of theoretical departure. Now, Frankfurt School would say the best way to critique is to see to what extent the critique can be practically applied in the life world of the community. Whether the critique can be translated into the terms of practice, the terms of practical reasoning that a particular community engages with in its own everyday life. So critique needs to be testified in terms of certain praxis that are arising from the ground. The critique has to be grounded in the praxis of the community. And that is something, again, very, very important. And from there on, one understands the praxis of the community, moves away from the life world, goes to the praxis. And moving from life world to praxis is to open up, as they say, the horizon of the social scientist herself, as well as the closed horizons of that community. Because praxis of the community then can become a subject of critique itself, and thereby the praxis can be transformed, or praxis can be retained as they are, becomes a major question in this critique tradition of social science, as Frankfurt School has pointed out. So you can see here that there are these transitions in phenomenology, and these transitions have to be understood now. And one of the major way to understand the transition is to understand the limitation of the very transition itself. Charles Taylor, who is not a phenomenologist but a critique of phenomenologist, has pointed out that certain kinds of intentions, motives, values that are available in a particular culture, through which a particular culture forms its own meanings, may not be available in my culture or in another culture. So in social sciences, what happens? We move from one set of intentions to another set of intentions, and we lose specificity. We lose concreteness of those universals in terms of which a particular society articulates. And therefore, we have to return to that concrete universal in terms of which a particular society articulates itself, and that will require a certain kind of effort to reground oneself, to resituate oneself in a particular target society. I think I give a kind of a semicolon and not a full stop, and leave it open here. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Professor Koshy and Professor Prasenjit, for this wonderful introduction of this phenomenological approach to qualitative research. So now the floor is open for discussion. So,
thank you for the kind words that you spoke. I have very little knowledge about phenomenology, to be frank, and I'm more concentrated on Indian philosophy than Western. So the only thing that I know about is that phenomenology is an approach that is which concentrate on the study of consciousness and the objects of direct experience. Where in Kashmir Saivism, when I'm going through text and I'm trying to understand the philosopher's point of view while saying the theory of recognition, or trying to explain that you are Shiva, and you were saying that we go and see the agent's perspective, like we try to understand without objectivity the only perspective. But I'm really confused here, like maybe Abhinav Gupta was there in like the 9th and 10th century, somewhere around that time. And obviously those scenarios, the world that he saw is somewhat different to the world that I am seeing. But through the text, I'm understanding what he's trying to say. But there is a very less or minimum chance that I can recreate what he was thinking correctly. So how is phenomenology as a method, as a research method, helping me to understand a philosopher of my own tradition? I don't know if the question is right or wrong, but it's just a point that was there in my mind.
Well, this is, shall I begin? Then you can elaborate further. This is exactly the problem which Gadamer, tried to point out in hermeneutical kind of understanding, that you have no access to the authorial perspective in a strict sense. Author alone knows, in a very strict sense of that, only the author knows. It comes to us as even actors. In the social world, I alone know why I do certain things. Unless I communicate it to you, you have no access to what are my goals and motives. Having said that, when it comes to the social world, there is particularly the idea of a community, the idea of a social group, etc., fairly well communicates to us what is the rationality for me to behave in a particular way. So the motives are, so to say, spelt out in terms of such publicness of my endeavor. But when it comes to reading a particular author of a particular historical time, how far are we justified in reading him in his own world? That possibility becomes really a problematic. So you need to mediate then the text that is available within your own, so to say, historicity. That kind of a mediation you cannot escape. That is why some of these hermeneuticians say that actually you are writing the text as you read. It's not that you are reading something. The text is in conversation with you as a reader, and in that process you are in a way writing or creating a text. In that process, are you losing something which the original author wanted to convey? Well, I would say that you may have that kind of sense of some loss there, perhaps, but then to point out to the what you call the folly of that kind of nostalgia, or something is lost, is no more with us, is to look at our own self, as Simmel, sociologist Simmel would say. This worry of that I have not understood the other fully is a misplaced worry, because we need to ask whether do we understand ourselves fully. Is the self is so transparent to oneself that we have this idea that I know myself completely. So if you allow that possibility of my knowledge is also not so transparent as knowledge of my own self, is not so transparent as we perhaps would wish it to be, the same worry about the other's intentions can also be, so to say, minimalized. So there I would intervene, stop, let proceed.
There's this important text by Harold Bloom, one of the Western critics majorly recognized in English literature. It's called Anxiety of Influence. And Harold Bloom would argue that the predecessors, the writers who are in the past, are so influential that as a reader, I can never come out of their influence. So Abhinava Gupta's influence crosses centuries and it still reaches us out. So there is a certain kind of an appeal that comes from the text itself. And you are to decode that appeal in you by comparing it with the kind of appeal that it creates in a community of readers. What kind of a canon of reading is produced out of Abhinav Gupta's text? A particular text gives rise to a particular canon of reading and a particular canon of interpretation. Now you have to see whether you agree with that canon, or you have something like making a radical departure from that canon or not. You can make indeed a radical departure from that canon by looking at a totally different way of interpreting the text, because a text is open to many other texts. which we call intertextuality. So Avinav Gupta's text could be opened up to, some of these scholars have done this, to some Japanese aesthetics text, or to some of the Black African texts, where the idea of taste, idea of, let's say, sublimity, can be given a more social interpretation, can be given an interpretation which is in terms of shared experience, or in terms of new kind of performances that can reenact a certain kind of experience that one has about the text. So there are ways in which you can open up new kinds of interpretation by making a departure from the established canon itself. And that will recreate Avinav Gupta, re-induce a new life in the text of Avinav Gupta. You know? So that's where you will be free from the worry, because you are already influenced by Avinav Gupta to the level best. Yeah.
I think this is a rejoinder to a follow-up question to what Sir said. In the Indian aesthetic theory, and I understand by what you talked, that the phenomenological approach helps us to objectively understand subjective experiences. In the Indian aesthetic theory, the aesthetic environment naturally creates a consensus of subjective experience, but it creates it only in a group of people called as the Sahridayas or the Kanashias. And it is the experience of only these Sahridayas that is credited. And if one must derive objective laws from subjective experience, it is only through the experience of these group of people called as the Sahridayas or the Kanashias. So is it proper to privilege a particular group when we have to derive objective knowledge out of subjective experience?
Okay. No, that particular group must be sufficiently diverse. It should not be confined to a particular cultural region or a particular kind of cultural tradition. Those who study Naitya Shastra, they would only be participants in readings of Avinav Gupta or following of Avinav Gupta's method in performing a theatre or some other art form. Rather, it should include people who are skeptics and who are ready to question Avinav Gupta. Now, if you have a community of diverse connoisseurs, then you won't have to be very, very careful about a canon that arises out of it. Canon means a certain system of thinking about a certain text, or a certain system of a culture of performance that arises out of those connoisseurs. So the protocols of understanding will not be limited by the connoisseurs alone. In fact, non-connoisseurs can contribute more than the connoisseurs themselves, and that possibility has to be opened up. So how do you open this up? You open it up in a comparative context. You can compare, let's say, statisticians of Avinav Gupta kind from another context, maybe from the European context, or maybe from, let's say, the Buddhist context, or maybe from the Tantric context. There are these Tantric aesthetic texts. You can compare Avinav Gupta and the Tantric aesthetics. So that will give a totally different kind of meaning to such a text and its effort to read. So non-connoisseurs will become equally important for you to take care of their perspective.
So, I mean, just to
add, please.
Within hermeneutics, Gadamer and all, they would say that understanding is not a direct, effortless event which happens as you read a text. It's a moving forth and back, and it's a play which involves. So in the process, you also, as someone belonging to the tradition, would start looking at it anew in that process. That's what he calls the fusion of horizons. It's not just your tradition that you finally project. It's there is a fusion of traditions or horizons. The others' perspective also start seeping into your own. And this is what also in another way to say that the fusion of horizon is also a language of contrast. Just as even to perceive anything, you need something which it is contrasted against. Otherwise, you can't. If I write something on this background with the same color, same color, without any contrast, you won't see it. In order to see it, you need a contrasting perspective. So translating into a larger, philosophical theme, it's the other also defines what I am, the self. The other also is part of the understanding of the self. So some of these worries of Sahridaya, as only as President is rightly emphasized, should not be only those assayers. There should be also someone who would challenge it, question it, then only a proper understanding in the sense in which Gadamer envisages as a fusion of horizon would result.
Much more productive in enjoying a particular performance by bringing others. Will it help us enjoy a performance much better than how we used to enjoy it before?
Well, perhaps one then need to ask, what is the goal of reading a text? Is it to explain, to understand, to criticize? When it comes to social reality, we often mention this. What is the goal of social scientific research? The positivist would simply say that it's explaining the reality. And the phenomenologist would say it is to understand the reality. The critical theorist would say, no, it's a changing. Marxist would say it's not even understanding, the point is to change it. You need to transform. So all these different kinds of goals you need to keep in mind. So if your aim of reading a text is purely a rasa, enjoyment, perhaps you may not be so
enjoyment will be guided by a certain kind of interpretation.
Right, that's what you are
of the act of performance. And in that interpretation, whether the participant is taking part or the participant's perspective in some way is molding the very process of enjoyment, is there in the Western tradition of Russia or Western aesthetic tradition, that participants are like the fourth dimension of performance. And a performance not only have time, space and performers, but it also has this fourth dimension of opening itself up to the viewers, to listeners, to audience, and their responses to it, which is not going to be of the same kind, that everyone will cry and everyone will laugh. It will be a mix of all possible rasas together, and that cannot be predicted what it could be. So that way, enjoyment will depend on a certain kind of interpretation.
See, the first question that I want to ask was, why does the question of hermeneutics at all arise? Is it because, from your response to what Niharika asked about Abhinav Gupta, it's like, we only have indirect access to an author's intent, what the author really meant. So we need certain frameworks and tools to sort of understand what the author means, and hence the question of hermeneutics arises. Is this the case, or is it the case that the intent does not really matter as much as what matters is what we want from the text and our purpose, which sort of seemed to come up by your response when you said how for the positivists their purpose is to find if there is a reality, or for the Marxists it's the question of they are not really concerned about the intent of what the author said while reading a text, but can I in some way use this text to enact social change? So which of these two or are there further reasons which gives rise to the possibility of hermeneutics at all?
Why do you read it in a disjunctive manner?
No, it's not. I don't know. So is it just the case that these are all reasons why we need?
Yeah, that's what I was trying to imply. It's not either or case. All these things seep into this project of understanding at various stages.
Because I think this seems to come up when possibly when there are traditionalist versus slightly revisionist interpretation of text. Mm-hmm. So is this really just a matter of what is their purpose when they get from the text? Is such a debate to be resolved in that way, in your opinion then? Because this is this thing that comes up repeatedly. I'm not so sure in other domains, but at least when in history of philosophy or even when there are Indian philosophical texts which are used in certain context, there are certain contemporary interpretations of Indian philosophical texts which have gained prominence in Western with especially philosophy departments in the West. So is this really, is this hermeneutic question just a question of difference in what they want to do?
Well, it may not be just as, a kind of, we can't at least afford to leave it as different kind of interpretations competing with each other. Certainly, you need to take a perspective. I mean, I remember this in one of my Suresh Chandra Holium, I mentioned about this. For example, at that time, it was being discussed in Indian Academia. That's the reason I took it as an example. This happened sometime in the early 2002 or 3. There was a revision of a NCERT textbook on history, where what was earlier used to be referred as the Russian Revolution, was described as a coup. It is just a military coup. Now, from what perspective do they characterize this? That can be. I mean, is it a coup or it's a revolution? You need to now somehow adjudicate. In other words, it's not that all interpretations may stand ultimately at the on an equal footing. You can, so to say, somehow find out that some interpretations may be better than others. Given, I mean, this is what even Professor Prasenjit also mentioned earlier. When you particularly focus into pragmatics, you need to choose. It's, of course, we do admit that there is conflict of interpretation. There is what they call essential contestability, as Professor Sundarajan used to say, essential contestability of the social sciences and world. However, much when you are addressing this kind of an event, I don't know how many of us would agree that it was a military coup, the Russian Revolution. Or coming back to our own thing, 1857, would it be merely a kind of indiscipline among the armed forces, or was it a freedom struggle? I mean, I'm sure we would get a set of evidences to, so to say, to arrive at a better understanding than a kind of a characterization comes from one perspective. That's my take on it.
Yeah, we were further a little bit of a technical answer. Authorial intentions are not completely dead, as Umberto Eco, the famous Italian semiotician, would say. He would say that the author mirrors who are his or her intended readers and who are not intended readers. So intended readers are present in the text, and you as a reader may not be an intended reader by the author. So author creates a set of intended readers. Now, the way intended readers now would understand the text, that will be the right kind of interpretation of the text. Umberto Eco sets a canon of interpretation in this way. But this is seriously questioned by Foucault, for example, who will say that a text has an outside which cannot be reduced and captured by the text. And that's a kind of a irreducible outside. The text has to open itself up to an irreducible, to a totally different outside. And then text will acquire a certain sense of meaning. Meaning will be reconstituted of that text. So you can take one or the other, but one is more conservative, the other is more liberal. So if we prefer liberal interpretation of text, then the text should be opened up to other traditions, to other possibilities. That is what the text does not say. What the text says, everyone can sort of capture it. But what the text is silent about, and why it is silent about, and where exactly the text is drawing a boundary between what it says and the unsaid part of the world, and how the reader traverses through that boundary, goes from one end to the other, depends on the effort of the reader. So that kind of initiative also has to be generated in the process of reading a text, and that will re-establish the need for hermeneutics.
Second question was, I think perhaps slightly more related to what I myself am working on, is when we talk of, now I want to understand what is the place of fundamental metaphysics, so to say, within phenomenological traditions. So is that question sort of sidestepped, in the sense, would they take a broadly what can be understood as a Kantian position to say the question of fundamental metaphysics is irrelevant because in some sense we are always limited to phenomena, or we are, what we can ever know is the life world of broadly where the mind meets the world, not anything beyond the realm of this mind meeting the world to understand what reality is in itself. because this arises because when I see a lot of contemporary phenomenologists who try to respond to certain questions in analytic philosophy, especially the mind-body problem and the things like that, it seems to me they are not really responding to the question so much as sidestepping or telling that probably this is not the question you should be looking at, but at a different question. So this seems to, this has taken the shape of what is called as neurophenomenology and things like that within contemporary philosophy of mind. So I want to understand, is there a place for metaphysics within phenomenological traditions?
Well, of course, you need to also be sensitive to the notion that phenomenology is not just one homogeneous. Of course, at one stage, Husserl said phenomenology is Heidegger and me, but then with being and time on board, Husserl had to believe that he was a solipsist, he alone was a phenomenologist. So that was the tragedy. So the point is that within phenomenology, there are different traditions. Of course, in some you may find certain kind of metaphysics, and of course even Husserl has been accused of by some of the later continental thinkers like Derrida and all, championing a kind of metaphysics of presence, that kind of fundamental idea of metaphysics of presence as is propounding. But you need to understand what was that issue philosophically that Husserl was responding to when he initiated the project of phenomenology. For him, it was a response to two prevalent modes of doing philosophy then, during the early part of the 20th century. One, he thought, was a kind of historicizing our knowledge, philosophy, a kind of historicism coming from the Hegelian tradition to the other was psychologism, again trying to reduce these kind of experiences as if it's only about the individual subjectivity kind of this. So that was the kind of response which Husserl wanted to bring in through phenomenology. So that is why he often emphasizes that phenomenology is a presuppositionless philosophy, that it doesn't have to understand phenomena in terms of certain preconceived theorems, preconceived notions of reality, which science is also a kind of metaphysics when it talks about reality, that it believes in a mathematical understanding of the world as what captures the reality. So Husserlian response as a presuppositionless philosophy is to look at the phenomenon as it presents or as it manifests itself. And that's why they are not going, the phenomenologists are saying that maybe these are not the questions that you need to ask. What is the fundamental, metaphysics behind this or reality behind this? Rather, how that process is taking place, how that phenomena appears to you in your understanding, in your consciousness, in your... So that was the project of Husserlian phenomenology.
The question is very, very important because there is a continuous tug of war between metaphysics and phenomenology all the time. Now, metaphysicians sort of arrive at a settled perspective on reality, and they formulate that settled perspective in terms of certain theories. Let's take a theory of meteorology, for example, which is a very typical metaphysical theory, how things are constituted. So they will say that the constituted thing is something always more than the constituents themselves. So the relationship between the constituted and the constituent, is a kind of a matter of analysis, and you have to break the constituted into constituent. Although they will maintain that the constituted is always bigger than, the greater than the constituents themselves. So metaphysical theories leave a gap normally inside it. Think about panpsychism, exactly from where the mind arises, and from mind how a description of the physical world or the experience of the physical world arises, exactly where it arises, and how the transition happens, still not answers. It's not answered. And to answer this question, how the transition happens from the physical to the mental, again to the physical, is something that is considered as Mysterian. There is a theory of Mysterianism within panpsychism. There is a theory of epiphenomenalism within panpsychism. There is a notion of explanatory gap within panpsychism. So, in other words, a metaphysical theory, and that there comes a very important intervention from Husserl, from Heidegger, and also from Derrida. Let me just quickly say. Husserl would say that a metaphysical theory misses its own object in the process of creating an object for itself. So the object of metaphysical theory for Husserl goes missing in ideas too. Husserl makes this point very clear. As far as Heidegger is concerned, who explains a lot from Plato to the Greek tradition to coming to Kant, Heidegger would say that any metaphysical idea is a synecdoche, which is constructing an idea out of very few elements, and then the idea must hang over those elements in an overarching manner. The idea, the metaphysical idea, must be overarching. That is the telos of metaphysics. The first principle of metaphysics is to seek ground, but the outcome of metaphysics is to have something which is constituted out of fewer elements, but at the same time hang over those fewer elements, as if metaphysics gives you a cloud of ideas. Kant and the problem of metaphysics, Heidegger would say. But Derrida would say this entire process of creating a metaphysics in order to answer the question about origination, from where something originates, the question about the structure of something, the question about origin, structure, and knowledge in metaphysical terms, actually closes metaphysics to certain kinds of answers. So metaphysics suffers from a closure. Now, to interpret that closure, you have to open up the closure to something which will challenge that kind of metaphysical formulation. So you take, let's say, if you are a positivist, you take the idea of negation as a challenge to the positivist metaphysics. And you try to see whether the idea of negation can be accommodated within positivist metaphysics. And when you find that it is not accommodated within the positivist metaphysics, by affirming truth or falsity, by affirming a two-valued logic, then the path that you recourse is that you start debunking what is negative. For example, if we look at the debate between, let's say, Nagarjuna's notion of Sunyata, and Shankara. There was a huge debate between Shankara and Nagarjuna that Bimal Krishna Motilal has talked about. So Bimal Motilal says that Nagarjuna's notion of emptiness is self-defeating because the very idea of emptiness itself is empty. It doesn't carry any substance. While Shankara would say that my notion of emptiness is at a transcendental level. You cross various levels to arrive at that kind of a notion of emptiness, and which you can further overcome by bringing in a notion of fullness or plenitude. Shankara's argument. So Shankara goes up in the kind of a positivist ladder, in the ladder of arriving at something more affirmative of a higher order reality. So methodologically speaking, one is somewhat like bottom up. The other one is somewhat like top down. The top down kind of metaphysics is to crash metaphysics at a certain level. And the bottom up kind of metaphysics is to rise to a certain level, beyond which, of course, you can't go. So both ways, in a sense, it suffers from a closure, and we have to break this closure. I stop here.
Taking off from what Koshy sir talked about, it seems like there is a prerequisite of a self, and a self that knows what it knows very clearly for phenomenology to work, I suppose. And at least in my work, which deals with Mantravada, which is an occult practice, and how it is used for treatment of patients with mental illnesses, it is very difficult to even claim a self. At most, one could think of fleeting selves. So when it comes to research, it looks like objectivity requires a generalization of patterns, whereas what I'm dealing with is many a times esoteric experiences. So at what point does one say, can one generalize esoteric experiences? Because I think the very point is that an experience is esoteric, and that is and it looks like only phenomenology can possibly come as close as it can to explaining esoteric experiences. But then how could one generalize it or think of it academically while it is beyond generalizing? So does phenomenology then become a methodology of marginality and what is beyond boundaries?
Problem. I mean, my first response would be perhaps to look at, if you want to see how phenomenology would try to understand this self in the making rather than self which is more, substantial kind of thing, is to look at the core of Husserl's notion of what he calls the doctrine of internal time consciousness, where, how we have this notion of a temporality which is contrasted with what we otherwise call as the objective time, the world time, the clock time, which is the objective time, which of course, as we know, may not be the same as what we call the subjective time, when we spend maybe as per the clock hours, 2 hours with a friend, but we don't realize that 2 hours has passed. It's just 5 minutes for us. That's a subjective time or lived time. But Husserl then says that this notion of temporality cannot be explained with this two understanding of objective time and subjective time. You need a deeper level of temporal consciousness, which is what he calls the internal time consciousness, which in a way founds both the subjective lived time as well as the objective time. So here Husserl talks about that every what he calls the primal present, the now moment, which you would say is actually a triad, which cannot be separated. They don't exist purely as one component, what Husserl calls the whole and part. The part which are detachable, Husserlian phenomenology would say, is a piece. Undetachable parts is called as a moment. So here it is a moment which cannot be detached. So the primal present would have what Husserl calls a trace of the past, the retention, as well as something which is anticipated, a protension. So every moment, primal present, would have an element of the past as well as an element of the future. That's his understanding. So I was just thinking whether in the kind of experiences that you would be analyzing can be understood in terms of this lack of awareness of the, or perhaps the actual duration of this retention is somehow displaced, reduced, or the protension is elongated so far that it becomes unrealistic. So perhaps some pathology can be worked out from this notion of internal time consciousness. That's my first response. I have not thought much about it.
First of all, the notion of self is not a settled concept. If you try to settle the notion of self, you have to think it to be an embodied concept. And also, self could be understood in terms of a certain kind of enactment. The self is an enacted self. The self is an extended self. The self is an n-worlded self. So, what kind of self you are talking about when you are talking of the self? Whether it's a first personal self that is engaged in a kind of reflexivity about itself, whether it's a second personal self, which is a self in relation to the other, is a second personal self, and whether it's a third personal self, where it assumes a kind of a point of view to observe itself as if it is observing itself from outside. Now, all these moves that one is making within the self are phenomenological moves. So, self can be captured, displaced and recaptured by way of doing a certain kind of phenomenology. That's a kind of an experimentation with oneself, also with the self of the others. And as far as the theoretical stance of phenomenology is concerned, phenomenology can talk about intentionality, which arises from a self and directed towards the world. But then there could be an other orientation. Once the self is oriented to the other, the self erases itself, and it experiences an otherness in terms of completely surrendering itself, merging itself, or rather annihilating itself. There's an annihilation of the ego here when the self is totally directed to the other. So that kind of self becomes a more prospective, a more fruitful notion of self because it engages itself with the other. Then there could be a self which is engaging itself with other such selves in an intersubjective manner, in a manner of reciprocity, in a manner of mutuality. That mutuality and reciprocity can arise in the process of having a certain kind of a community of understanding, or a community which exchanges about how one understands the other. So that way self is caught into a number of engagements. Which engagement you will take will determine what kind of self you are going to talk about.
Third is a slightly more general and perhaps a naive question as well. I want to understand what is it we want to know when we talk about the methodology of philosophy. So, for example, if we talk about methodology of the social sciences, and then in response we can talk about the phenomenological approaches to collecting qualitative data. So here the question of methodology is perhaps a little clearer because we want to go and understand something out there, whether there is an objective out there or not, we want to go and understand. And if we think there is an objective out there, we might choose certain kind of tools like questionnaires, which the methodology is translating to the method. And then, or if we think there is a slightly constructed reality, we might choose methods like interviews or ethnography and so on. That seems to be the methodology of social sciences. But I want to understand, if somebody were to ask, and this is a question, if I look back, when I was preparing my research proposal, I had to think, what is your method going to be? Now, what is it we want to know when we ask that question with respect to philosophy? And more pragmatically, how do we specify an answer to it? Is it by specifying the tradition from which the literature we are going to engage with? Or do we specify certain other forms of reasoning that we are going to employ? Or what I often find is perhaps this question is not so explicitly addressed or mentioned in philosophical texts or in philosophical research as much as in more empirical disciplines such as social sciences or the sciences. So I wanted your thoughts on that.
Interesting, yeah. This perhaps at one stage of our career as a student of philosophy, all of us might have faced. What is the methodology of philosophy? Yes. What is it that we do? I mean, sometimes even some of the senior colleagues from other disciplines ask when they sit in the faculty research committees, you don't have a review of literature, you don't have, what's the methodology, what's the goal? I mean, then we have to say, no, it's a different kind of enterprise that we do. But as a student of phenomenology, my response would be, I would look at it this way. The default setup for all of us as conscious being in this Lebenswelt, life world, is the natural attitude, as Husserl calls it. And we are in the not naturalistic, natural attitude, where we take things for what they are. For example, now in the natural attitude, we are all sitting here in this room talking about phenomenology approaches, etc. But then philosophy begins from a phenomenological perspective when you shift from this natural standpoint, from the natural attitude to what Husserl would call the phenomenological attitude. You can replace it with philosophical attitude. So what is it that happening in the phenomenological attitude? In the phenomenological attitude, you don't take these things as what you call for its face value, the natural attitude. You begin to reflect on that. You begin to ask, why is it that way? So the methodology, in a nutshell, from a phenomenological perspective, the methodology of philosophy is a reflective approach to whatever you understand or face. So that is, in other words, to enter into the phenomenological attitude. I mean, that's how I would put it generally.
Just to extend on the question of method is a major question, which was there starting from Descartes' time. So when Descartes says the method is the method of doubt, with a writer that there is something very basic about method, that one who is doubting cannot doubt that the act of doubting is taking place. But people in the post-Cartesian world have gone beyond this. You begin with doubt, and then you question your own doubt, you see. So philosophy follows a method of self-critique. A kind of auto-critique is generated by philosophical methodology. It takes up a subject and it tries to interpret that subject in terms of maybe a framework of argumentation or in terms of a kind of a coherent interpretation, you know. And when philosophy adopts that methodology, it is justified in terms of a background theory. Maybe you believe in a coherence theory of truth, or maybe you believe in a correspondence theory of truth, or maybe you believe in an idea of strong free will, which assumes a certain kind of freedom, moving beyond the causal limits of the physical world. So you have some such supportive background theory when you begin a framework of analysis or a framework of understanding. When you do not have a background theory to justify your movement in philosophy, you create a possible world of theories, you know. You can foreground a certain theory. You can sort of, you know, project a certain kind of theory that will justify your kind of analysis and your kind of understanding. And that theory is drawn from certain branches of philosophy. And if those branches cannot provide, the philosopher himself can develop such a theory, is entitled to develop such a theory in the foreground, in terms of which the current exercise of interpretation and analysis could be carried out. So therefore, methodology here is a creative method. It is autocritical, it is self-critical, but it is moving forward into an uncharted terrain in order to place itself or resituate itself in what I do not know. Therefore, Professor Dayakrishna used to say, in a very lighter way, he used to say, the domain of knowledge in philosophy is always far lesser than the domain that is unknown. It is the domain of the unknown that propels us from the domain of known to the domain of the unknown, and that is the methodology of philosophy. So that's one answer.
Taking it from my memory, you may correct me. I think it is Devi Prasad Chattopadhyay in What is Living and What is Dead. He talks about a methodology of philosophy where he says that philosophical question begins when there is this kind of a doubt, because you referred to Descartes actually. A possibility of both this as well as that. You know, the expression he talks about is that Botman's logic. What is in Sanskrit says Vipradipatti Janya Samshaya. I mean that's the term he says in Indian philosophy. Vipradipatti Janya Samshaya, a doubt which arising from equal and opposing possibilities. That's the occasion for philosophy, and that's the, I mean, in other words, as you have rightly put it, it's that skeptical concern is what propels philosophical.
Right. And there are many such cues actually, just to add to that. Derrida would say that philosophy is something catachristic. Catachresis is a word which is available in Plato. When one side is called by its opposite, and the opposite calls that side as its opposite, and again that is called by another opposite, you see. So there is this perpetual opposition, you know, which is catachresis, and it is in the catachresis that you situate your method.
So, very briefly, just a question, just a follow-up Mira's question, is that suppose if you talk about the esoteric experience, so to say, just and about this phenomenology of internal time consciousness in Husserl, so about this potential retention, and through this potential and retention I am able to own up that experience, it becomes a lived experience. But suppose if there is some experiences which I find problematic sometimes in internal time consciousness, experience of traumatic experience, so where the time is out of joint and I am not able to categorize it that, because precisely it is trauma, or say it is a kind of a overwhelming experience, mystical experience, which Jean-Luc Marion talks about, saturated phenomena. So how to think of these experiences, because these are precisely there is some outside which cannot be captured through the the framework of the internal time consciousness. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's a challenge for that kind of a model. But perhaps, I mean, so this is what Husserl would say as what gives us a sense of time, this internal time consciousness. But the kind of experiences which esoteric experiences where we lose that sense, traumatic experiences. It could be that somehow the ability of the agent to retain, that is what is now in the question. So couldn't we explain this using the same insights from Husserl, saying that somewhere this is disrupted? So it's not that what Husserl would say as internal time consciousness is not the correct way of understanding time. Rather, these occasions are such kind of boundary experiences where this model, this what you call operation is disrupted. So what causes the disruptions and how it can be explained by various other kinds of theories. You would like to?
Yeah, I can just implement this. Husserl has this interesting concept of liminality. So there are these cases of liminal experiences where the time consciousness is minimalized. Thereby Husserl would say that time consciousness is not an essential constituent of our thought or of our experiencing a certain kind of experience. So this shows that there is a primal layer of experience which can never be sort of extricated, even in an extremely traumatic condition. In an extremely traumatic vegetative condition, the self is able to recapture some of its past. May not be entire past. That may be a minimal recapturing of the past. Even cognitive science has shown this. So there is an overlap between what is minimal and what is presently happening. And in that overlap, a new space of experience opens up, which is extra-temporal. Husserl uses this word, extra-temporal, in a sense outside time, or which could be called as
atemporal also uses.
Atemporal, which can also be called timeless, you see. So, both ways, So it's not necessary that time and space are absolute essential attributes of our thinking and of our consciousness. Especially the case of trauma probably creates a new sense of time, which is important.
Finally, from NIAS CSP team, we again thanks to Professor Koshy and Professor Prasenjit Biswas for this session, and we thank all of our CSP participants who has made the discussion very live and interesting. So thank you all.
Thank you all for being here. It was slightly interaction.